I spent 32 years working with concrete and steel, and the one thing I know about structures is this. The cracks that bring a building down are never the ones you can see from the street. They hide in the joints, behind the drywall, underneath the foundation where nobody thinks to look. You walk past a collapsing building every single day and call it home, because the facade is still standing and the lights still come on when you flip the switch. That is exactly what I did with my family. My name is Daniel, and I am 62 years old. I retired early from a career as a civil engineer, 30 years with the same firm in Columbus, Ohio, finishing as a senior project director. I know how to read blueprints. I know how to calculate load tolerance. I know, better than most people, exactly how much weight a structure can hold before it gives way. I did not apply any of that knowledge to my own house. My wife, Carol, passed away 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday in the extended family, who kept a jar of peppermint candies on the kitchen counter for no reason except that she liked them, and who used to fall asleep during the first 20 minutes of every movie we ever watched together. I never told her that I found it charming. I wish I had told her more things. After she was gone, I rattled around our house in Dublin, Ohio. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms. The oak tree in the backyard that my son used to climb when he was 8 years old. The house was paid off. I had a solid pension, a healthy investment portfolio, and more space than one man needed. My financial advisor, a careful and honest woman named Patricia, used to joke that I was the most boring client she had ever had, because I never asked her to do anything reckless. I took that as a compliment. My son, I will call him my son, because that is what he is, and what he will always be, came to me 2 years after Carol died with his wife at his side. They had been married for 6 years by then. She was the kind of woman who smiled with her mouth and not with her eyes, who always said the right thing at the right moment in a way that felt rehearsed. My son sat across from me at the kitchen table, where he had eaten breakfast for 18 years, and explained that they were in a difficult spot. His business, a small landscaping company he had started 3 years earlier, was behind on its loans. They were renting an apartment they could no longer afford. They needed somewhere to land while they got back on their feet. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. They moved in with 2 carloads of belongings in March, and by June the house looked and felt like it belonged to someone else. His wife rearranged the living room furniture without asking. She put Carol's ceramic collection in a box in the garage because it was, in her words, cluttered. My son did not say anything about that, and neither did I, though I stood in the garage afterward and held one of those pieces for a long time. The plan had been 6 months. 6 months stretched to 12, and 12 became 18. And somewhere in the second year, I stopped counting. My son's business did not recover, which I later understood was because he had stopped putting real effort into it. His wife had ideas, always ideas, about opportunities and investments and growth. She had discovered, in the way that certain people discover things, that if you simply ask a person who loves you for money with enough confidence and enough reasonable-sounding explanation, the money tends to appear. I was that person. I was the bank with no interest rate and, as it turned out, no memory. $10,000 to stabilize the business. Later, $12,000 for a truck the business needed. Then $8,000 for a course she wanted to take in marketing. Then a loan. She called it a loan of $22,000 to cover a tax issue that turned out, when I eventually had my accountant look at it, to not have been an actual tax issue at all. My neighbor and oldest friend, a retired high school principal named Frank, used to sit with me on the back porch on Sunday evenings. We had done this for 20 years. Frank had a habit of saying things sideways, never direct, never confrontational, but always true. One evening in the second autumn after my son moved in, he set down his coffee cup, looked out at the oak tree, and said, "You know what I noticed, Danny? You used to talk about Portugal. You and Carol had that trip planned. We still might go," I said. Frank nodded slowly. "Sure," he said, and he did not say anything else. I thought about that for a week. I had a part-time consulting arrangement with a smaller engineering firm, something I kept going more for the structure of it than for the income. 3 days a week, I would drive to their office on the east side of Columbus and review project drawings. I liked the work. I liked having somewhere to be. On a Tuesday morning in October, I was walking down the corridor toward the conference room when the room tilted sideways. That is the only way I can describe it. The floor came up to meet me, and I put my hand on the wall, and then I was sitting on the carpet and a young woman from accounts payable was kneeling beside me asking if I could hear her. They called the ambulance. I was conscious the whole ride, which somehow made it more frightening, not less. The paramedic, a young man with steady hands and a calm voice, told me my blood pressure was dangerously elevated and that I had likely fainted from a combination of hypertensive crisis and exhaustion. At the hospital, the attending physician used the word stroke and then said we were watching to determine whether one had occurred or been narrowly avoided. They admitted me and put me in a room and attached me to more monitors than I had ever been connected to in my life. The nurse, a practical woman who reminded me of an aunt I had once loved very much, asked me who she should call. I gave her my son's number. I know what happened next because she told me afterward, and because the hospital has a policy of documenting emergency contact attempts. She called my son's cell phone. He answered on the third ring. She explained that his father had been admitted, that his condition was being evaluated, that the physicians wanted family present while they determined the severity. My son said, "Is he conscious?" She said yes. My son said, "Okay, so it's not like he's not, it's not that serious yet?" She said they wanted family present as a precaution and that the situation could change. There was a pause. And then my son said, "We're actually in the middle of something right now. A closing. We're buying a house. Signing papers. The whole thing. Can I call back in a couple hours?" She told him that the physicians would prefer sooner. He said, "He's a tough guy. He'll be okay. Tell him I'll be there tonight." She came into my room and told me, gently and professionally, that my son had indicated he would arrive later that evening. She did not editorialize. She did not have to. I was lying in a hospital bed connected to a cardiac monitor with a possible stroke being evaluated, and my son was signing papers on a house. I asked her one question. I asked whether he had mentioned where the closing was, which bank or title company. She checked her notes and gave me the name. I lay there for a long time after she left. A house. They were buying a house. And I knew, in the way you know things you have been deliberately choosing not to look at directly, that I understood where the down payment had come from. The $22,000 loan, the $12,000 for the truck, the $8,000 for the marketing course. I had been the down payment. I had been the entire down payment, assembled piece by piece over 2 years, in small enough increments that I would not see the total until I was lying in a hospital bed, doing arithmetic, with nothing else to do. Frank arrived at the hospital at 4:30 that afternoon. I had not called him the nurse, without my asking, had found his number in my phone and called him herself, because she was a good person, and she could read a room. He sat in the chair next to my bed, drank the terrible coffee from the machine in the hallway, and did not say anything about my son not being there. He just stayed. My son arrived at 7:15 in the evening. His wife was with him. She hugged me briefly and said it had been a scary day for all of them, and I noticed that she was wearing a new coat. My son shook my hand, which struck me as a strange thing to do with your father in a hospital bed, and asked what the doctors were saying. I told him. He nodded and said that was a relief and that he was sure I would be back to normal in no time. His wife mentioned that the signing had gone smoothly. I said that was good to hear. They stayed for 40 minutes and then said they had to get back because the dog needed feeding. We do not have a dog. After they left, Frank looked at me for a moment. He said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to make some phone calls, and I need you to not ask me about them until I'm ready to tell you." He said, "All right." I had been in this hospital for 11 hours with a possible stroke, alone except for a friend who had not been called by anyone in my family. My son was in a house that my money had purchased, and I was 62 years old with, according to 3 separate physicians, a heart that had been under sustained stress for longer than it should have been. Not from genetics, from weight I had been carrying that was not mine to carry. Patricia, my financial advisor, answered on the second ring when I called her the next morning. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, in her careful and precise way, "Daniel, I have been waiting for you to make this call for about 14 months. She had seen the withdrawals. She had seen the pattern. She had not pushed because it was not her place, but she had been watching. I told her what I wanted to do. She said she could have the first steps completed within 48 hours. I also called my attorney, a man I had worked with since the early days of my career. He was the kind of attorney who spoke in short sentences and never used 2 words when one would do. I laid out the situation. He asked a few questions. Then he said, "I'll have documents ready by Thursday." I was discharged on Wednesday. The physicians cleared me on the condition that I reduce stress significantly, take medication daily, and follow up within 2 weeks. I told them I intended to make some significant lifestyle changes. The attending doctor, the same one who had used the word stroke on the first day, nodded and said that was the right response to an event like this. He did not know how significant the changes were going to be. I had also, during my 2 days in the hospital, made a call to a man named Roy, who runs a small investigation firm out of Westerville. Frank had given me his name about a year earlier, offhandedly, in the way that Frank occasionally said things that seemed casual but were not. Roy was thorough and discreet. I gave him a list of specific things I needed documented. He told me 2 weeks. I went home. I behaved normally. I thanked my son for visiting the hospital. I let his wife make dinner 2 nights in a row and told her it was good. I sat in the living room and watched television and went to bed at a reasonable hour. I was polite and quiet and completely invisible, which I had apparently been for 2 years without realizing it. On the 14th day, Roy delivered a report. The house they had purchased was 3 miles from mine, a 4-bedroom colonial, in a neighborhood I knew well. The down payment had been $41,000. The tax issue, the truck, the marketing course, the business stabilization money, the various smaller amounts I was now finding in my own bank records that I had not examined closely enough. It added up to just over $53,000 over 26 months. Some of it was clearly recorded as loans in text messages my son had sent me, which he appeared to have forgotten I had kept. Some of it had been transferred directly from my account through a password I had given him during a period when I had a hand injury and needed help managing online transactions. He had not stopped using that access when my hand healed. Roy had also documented, through a combination of public records and observation, that my son's landscaping business had been functionally inactive for nearly a year. He had 1 remaining client, which was me. He mowed my lawn. I read through the report twice, put it in an envelope, and gave it to my attorney. Then I called Patricia. The process took 3 weeks. It was methodical and quiet and entirely legal. The house in Dublin, which was in my name alone, went on the market through an agent who was a friend of Frank's, at a price that was aggressive and fair. An offer came within 11 days. Patricia restructured my investment accounts, removed joint access I had inadvertently granted during the period of my hand injury, and moved my primary assets into a trust structured in a way that my attorney and I had carefully arranged together. My will was revised. My estate planning was revised. Every digital account with a shared password was closed and reopened with a new one. I also found a small house, a rental, to start nothing elaborate. A 2-bedroom craftsman in a town called Granville, about 40 minutes east of Columbus. Frank had family there and knew the area. The rent was reasonable. The backyard had a garden that the previous tenant had maintained and abandoned. And the landlord said, I was welcome to do whatever I liked with it. I arranged for a moving company to come on a Thursday, when my son and his wife were both, according to their established routine, away from the house until late afternoon. I took what was mine. Carol's ceramic collection came with me, every piece. Her photographs, my tools, my books, the oak rocking chair from the bedroom that had been my father's, I left everything else. The furniture, the television, the kitchen appliances I had bought. On the kitchen counter, I left an envelope. Inside the envelope were two things. The first was a letter. I will not reproduce it in full, because some of it is private, in the way that certain things between a father and a son will always be private, no matter what has happened between them. But I will say that I was honest. I told him what I had found. I told him the amounts. I told him about the hospital, and about the closing, and about the 40 minutes. I told him that I was not writing the letter out of anger, because anger had not been what I felt lying in that hospital bed. What I had felt was something quieter and more final than anger. I told him that I hoped, genuinely, that he would find a way to build a life he was proud of, because I had spent 30 years building things, and I knew that the ones built on solid ground were the only ones worth having. The second thing in the envelope was a copy of Roy's report. I was in Granville by 4 o'clock. My son called at 6:17. I did not answer. He called 11 more times over the course of that evening. His wife called 4 times from her own number. At 9:43, a number I did not recognize called twice, and I later determined it was a neighbor of theirs. I turned the phone face down and sat in the kitchen of the Craftsman house and drank a cup of coffee and listened to the quiet, which was extraordinary. The next morning, I called my son back. He spoke for a long time, most of it a version of explanation that shifted between minimizing and reframing, and a kind of controlled panic about what the sale of the Dublin house would mean for his living situation. He had been expecting to be there for another year, at minimum. He asked what he was supposed to do. I told him that he was 34 years old, and that figuring out what to do next was precisely the kind of thing a 34-year-old man was capable of. He asked about the money, whether there was some arrangement that could be made, whether I was serious about the figures in the report. I told him the figures were documented and accurate, and that I had forwarded the relevant records to my attorney. He said, "Dad, you don't have to involve lawyers." I said, "I know. I chose to." There was a long silence. Then he said my name, just my name, in a way that I recognized. It was the voice he had used as a small boy when he wanted something, and understood that wanting it very much was its own kind of argument. I had given in to that voice many times over 30 years. I had built, I realized, an entire financial structure on giving in to it. I said, "I love you. That's not in question. But I'm done." I hung up. What came next unfolded over about 4 months, and I am going to tell you about it plainly, because I think plain is the right way to tell it. The sale of the Dublin house closed. The proceeds went into my trust. My son and his wife moved into their new house, the one with the $41,000 down payment assembled from my accounts, and for a period they appeared to be managing. My attorney had advised me that the documentation Roy had compiled was sufficient to pursue a civil claim for financial elder abuse under Ohio law, and that the text messages in which my son had acknowledged amounts as loans strengthened the position considerably. I left that decision in place and waited. What moved things forward was not me. My son's wife, it turned out, had debts I had not known about, credit accounts in both their names that had been financed in a way that did not survive my exit from the picture. When the easy source of additional funds disappeared, the pressure that had been building in their finances began to show in the structure, the way it always does. There were missed payments. There were, according to Roy, who I had retained for a follow-up, creditor calls. There was a business loan my son had taken in the company name, personally guaranteed. It also emerged, and this was not something I had known or anticipated, that my son's wife had been doing something very similar with her own parents, who were in their late 60s and living in Cincinnati. Her father had a health condition. The money she had directed his way over 3 years, documented by his accountant when the accountant began asking questions about account discrepancies, was substantial. Her parents hired an attorney. The case that resulted was filed in Franklin County, and it was not the kind of thing that stays quiet. Elder financial abuse cases rarely do, especially when the documentation is thorough. My son was named as a co-defendant because his name was on the loan records and the text messages and 2 wire transfers. His attorney, a young man who I suspect was hired on credit, called my attorney twice to explore settlement terms. I attended one day of the proceedings. Just one. Frank drove me. We sat in the gallery, and I watched my son sit at a table in a suit that was slightly too large for him, next to his wife, who was not smiling with any part of her face. And I felt something that I did not entirely expect. It was not satisfaction, exactly. It was more like the feeling you have when you are standing in front of a building after the demolition crew has finished, a kind of calm emptiness where something complicated used to be. The judge in the case, a precise and no-nonsense woman who had clearly seen this pattern before, was unsparing in her findings. She noted the documentation, the pattern of behavior, the vulnerability of the victims, and the deliberate nature of the transfers. The financial penalties were significant. The terms of repayment were structured in a way that would follow them for years. My son looked at me once, from across the room. I looked back at him. I did not look away, and neither did he. For a moment that lasted longer than I would have guessed either of us could hold it. Then the bailiff said something, and he turned away, and I put my hand on Frank's arm and said I was ready to go. We drove back to Granville, and Frank came in for coffee, and we sat on the small back porch of the Craftsman house, which had an excellent view of the garden I had spent the spring and early summer reconstructing. There were tomatoes coming in, and some lavender along the fence that I had not planted but that had apparently decided to stay. Frank looked at the garden for a while. Then he said, "How are you feeling?" I thought about it. "Lighter," I said. "Lighter than I have in a while." He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. He said, "Carol would have said, 'You waited too long.'" "She would have been right," I said. We sat there as the light changed. A neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the street, the friendly kind of barking that means nothing in particular. The lavender moved slightly in the wind, and the smell of it came across the porch, and I thought about how strange it is that you can spend decades being a person who builds things carefully and still fail to notice when the thing you are building is a cage. I am 62 years old. I have good health better now. With the medication and the reduced stress, and the garden and the walks I take most mornings along the path by the creek at the edge of town. My blood pressure is normal for the first time in what my physician estimates has been at least 3 years. Patricia tells me my financial position is, as she puts it, boring and excellent. I have a neighbor in Granville named Harriet who is 70 and grows the best sweet corn I have ever eaten, and who has a very firm opinion about Ohio State football that I do not share but that I enjoy arguing about. Frank comes on Sunday evenings. Still, we drink coffee, and sometimes, if the weather is right, we sit on the back porch and watch the garden go dark. He does not say much, and I do not say much, which is the particular luxury of a friendship that is old enough not to need to. My son has called 3 times since the proceedings concluded. I have spoken to him twice. The conversations are short and careful, in the way that conversations are when 2 people are standing on either side of something that has already happened and cannot be reversed. I do not know what comes next between us. I am not sure he knows either. There may be time to find out. What I know is this. I built houses for 30 years, and I understood that no structure is stronger than its foundation. I lived in a house for 2 years that was sinking beneath me and called the gradual tilt normal. I let people I loved remove load-bearing supports one by one and told myself the ceiling was still level because I did not want to look up. But here is the other thing I know, the thing that matters more. A building that has been stripped to its frame can be rebuilt. You start with what is solid. You repair what can be repaired, and you remove what cannot. You pour the foundation fresh, and you let it cure before you put any weight on it. Because that is how concrete works. And that, it turns out, is also how the rest of it works. My porch faces east. In the mornings, when the light comes in low across the garden, I sit with my coffee, and I do not hurry. I have learned, late and at considerable cost, the extraordinary value of not being in a hurry. The lavender is doing well. The tomatoes are better this year than last. The creek path is beautiful in the autumn when the maples turn, and I walk it most days now, all the way to the bend and back, which takes 40 minutes and leaves me feeling like myself again, which is, I think, the whole point.